Morning, Glory America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. It's Hugh Hewitt, July the 19th, in year of our Lord 2022. I've got so much coffee in me. I've been up since like 2 o'clock in the morning here on the East Coast because the rain in Maine came mainly on our house last night. I have no idea how much it rained last night, but it was buckets and buckets. Now, good rule of nationally syndicated talk radio is don't talk about the weather because nobody cares where you don't live because it's not the same thing. But we're going to talk about the weather today in Europe in just a moment. But I thought I would preface that by saying it's been extraordinarily wonderful at Studio North for the last month. But last night it was just, okay, we saved all the rain for last night. So I've been awake a long time. And no matter how much rain came down, it's not going to match the precipitous fall in Joe Biden's approval rating, according to CNBC. He has hit an all-time new low for his economic approval. He just doesn't know what he's doing. Donald Trump's economic approval bottomed out at 41%, according to CNBC. Barack Obama's at 37%. President Biden's has dropped to 30%. 30% for Joe Biden on the economy. You tell me who's going to win November's election. So the weather story, I mean, Europe is baking. And they're going to hit a record, if they haven't already hit a record, in Great Britain today, a 363-year record. They've only been tracking heat in the United Kingdom for 363 years, and it's going to get up to 104 today, I think. I think that's what it, don't ask me to do centigrade Fahrenheit. I just don't do it. For the benefit of everyone, we should just go to Fahrenheit. We are the leader of the West, and we should just go to Fahrenheit. The highest official temperature currently has been 101.7 degrees Fahrenheit, and that happened last year, actually 3 years ago, 2019. But it's going to go up there today. Now, you say, well, is this a crisis? I don't think it is. I quote from the Washington Post, 104-degree Fahrenheit day in the United Kingdom is a once every 100 to 300-year event. It goes on to say, models predict such days could happen once every 15 years by 2100 if countries meet their carbon emission promises, or once every 3 or 4 years if they continue to emit as much pollution as they do today. So is that a crisis, or is that a reality to be mitigated, given that we need energy? Energy fuels quality of life. Energy is freedom. Energy is getting people out of dire poverty. Energy is building roads and houses and an apartment complex. Energy is everything. And so you can't just say we're not going to do energy, or unless you want to go back to prehistoric times. And we're not doing that. And, people in the developing world do not want to do that. People do not want to live in huts with cook stoves emitting smoke. Their quality of life just sucks. And as the rain came down last night and I was awake, I was thinking about the fact there's a significant homeless population. I saw them on my one trip to Portland with Tony and Denise this week. And I see them everywhere, but in the summer, they're not dumb. They come north too. And those who can, when they come out, I was thinking of people just getting deluged by the rain on the street. And then, as happens at 2 o'clock in the morning, I began thinking about the 70,000 people on the streets of Los Angeles who are baking, and the 2.2 million people who are walking across the border, people who are actually impoverished beyond belief. And then you think about the people who are, quote, living rough in Great Britain and how hot it is. And you wonder, okay, it is a crisis for them, but life is a crisis for them. Are we really focused on the right things for human beings? And I'm not sure carbon emissions ranks above housing those people in a utilitarian sense, or in a liberty sense, or in a Christian sense, or any kind of religious sense. I just don't think models forecasting climate doom inform daily choices very much. But boy, are we going to hear a lot about it. New York Times, extreme heat puts life on hold in Britain, a land not built for it. Actually, they had a parliamentary session yesterday, so it didn't put that on hold, and the Tories got down to 4 candidates. Tom Tugendhat was voted off the Prime Minister Island, as was expected. And today they're going to have another vote. And Kemi Badenoch is not expected to survive. But Michael Gove, who's the smartest member of the British Parliament, is out there pitching her. And he went on one of the Brit stations yesterday on LBC with Andrew Marr and made this pitch about Kemi Badenoch. Cut number 1, Michael Gove.
To be fair, she has more ministerial experience than Tony Blair or David Cameron had when they became Prime Minister. And she's been in...
They had run a party, of course.
Indeed.
A big job.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also, she's the same age as Rishi, and she's been in government in 3 very different roles, all of which she's accomplished successfully. I know all of the candidates. I've either worked with them because they've been junior ministers in departments that I've been running, or they've supported me in previous leadership elections. I have no hesitation in saying that of all of the people who worked with me in a department that I ran, Kemi was undoubtedly the outstanding minister. She has an intellectual grasp second to none. She has a capacity to communicate with confidence, but also with empathy. And also, she's brave. It's a rare junior minister who tells their Secretary of State where to get off because that Secretary of State is getting something wrong. Kemi did that to me repeatedly. Now, there were a number of occasions where I told her that I disagreed. She took it in very good part. But it's that confidence based on an understanding from first principles of what you want to achieve that you need in a leader.
You clearly like her, but it would be one heck of a gamble, wouldn't it?
Well, we have in front of us, I think, a range of good candidates. And as I say, I've worked with them all and I respect them all. But I think that Kemi has something special. And she reminds me in a way, even though her politics are different, of both David Cameron and Ruth Davidson. I supported David Cameron in 2005 when there were only about 5 or 6 MPs who were, because I knew that he had star quality. I remember Ruth Davidson when she was running for the leadership of the Scottish Conservatives. She had only one member of the Scottish Parliament supporting her. But when I saw her, I thought, she's the star, she's going to win. And Kemi has something of the same qualities.
And you feel the same thing. Explain to me how she gets into the final 2, because looking at the numbers, I just can't see it.
Well, I think that some of the votes from Suella Braverman will go to Kemi today. I think that some of the other candidates have backers who are feeling buyer's remorse. And who may well come to Kemi. I also think that the logic of many of the people who've been supporting Tom Tugendhat, a friend of mine, the logic of wanting a clean start, I think would incline them towards Kemi. So everything could align. It is possible. And I think that ultimately one of the things we've seen during this race is the more that people see of Kemi, the more impressed they are.
That's a very good summary by Michael Gove, who I repeatedly tell you is the smartest guy in the British government. And today they will have a 4th round of the 4 remaining contenders between noon and 2. And noon, of course, there is very early here. So we will find out probably around 3 o'clock their time, mid-morning here in the United States. And those 3... we'll go another round. I'm not sure when the next round is. Maybe it's in a couple of days. But right now, Rishi Sunak has 115 votes. Penny Mordaunt has 82. Liz Truss has 71. And Kemi Badenoch has 58. Mr. Tugendhat's 31 are free agents. And anyone can change their mind at any time. There's a lot of strategic voting going on. The Brits just get down to 2, and then they ask the 200,000 official members of the Tory party. And I do not know how you become to pick. And if you were picking on best for American conservatives, you would pick Kemi. Absolutely. She's right in the strike zone of American politics right now, being anti-woke and articulating a reason why that matters. If you have no idea why that matters, the hot air story on what is going on in schools is really eye-opening. It's written, it quotes from a leftist. And if you go to hotair.com, you'll be able to find it. Or if you look at my Twitter feed down a little bit, you'll see progressive public school teacher in a blue state. Things are as bad as you've heard. John Sexton wrote this piece yesterday, quoting a Substack piece by Wesley Yang, who's not the actual author. The actual author is anonymous, a leftist, a big one. I hate capitalism. I support abortion on demand. I unironically use phrases like systems of oppression in the dominant culture. The last big paper I put together for my undergraduate degree is on critical race theory. But my fellow leftists are still willing to try that just incredibly deranged ideological maneuvers, including giving white kids lower grades purposefully in order to close the racial equity gap. And so when Kemi Badenoch in the United Kingdom is campaigning as a black woman, as a UK Londoner born in London but raised in Nigeria, against wokeism, She would be good for the West generally. Provided they keep Ben Wallace on as Minister of Defense, I could live with any of them. Don't go anywhere, America. I'll be right back. I'm Hugh Hewitt, political correspondent for them. David, I'm talking about a Wall Street Journal essay by, or a reporting essay, Rachel Feinzing. You can't make up for lost time, but these parents are trying. That, and you're a parent, so I really wanted to ask you, and I'm going to ask Byron York this next hour as well. Do you think the COVID years were as cataclysmic as 9/11 or impactful as the Kennedy assassination or the Vietnam protest? I mean, are they that disruptive that you feel obliged to splurge on big things that your kids missed?
Well, Hugh, I've been pondering this because I think my wife and I were very lucky. My boys had each other, we had each other, and the four of us, with a couple of other, with one particular family in particular, but even with members of my extended family, tried to do things to mitigate the impact of COVID. Certain kinds of traveling, certain kinds of gatherings, getting out of the house on a regular basis. But I think I realized that for many people, it wasn't as easy. And they either didn't feel comfortable doing some of the things we did or were not able to for medical or financial reasons. So many people that were in industries that depended on people gathering and traveling lost their jobs and saw reduced incomes. And so in some ways, I feel like I just endured it and didn't think about it and thought, wow, one day I'm going to look back on this. But I think for a lot of people, the more I think about it and talk to people about it as we think about it and talk about it in retrospect, I think it was that for them. And I think we're not going to know the complete impact of it for quite a long time.
Now, obviously, for some people, we stipulate people died. And so obviously it's a parent dying. That's the worst possible situation. But I also know that in the great pandemic of 1918, more people died and nobody ever talked about it. The Great Influenza book describes that. That was something to be endured. It was not the Great Depression generation. It was not the World War II generation. The pandemic generation was not it was the World War I generation, David. And so I think we do obsess about what happens to us in the now as opposed to taking a longer view about where it fits in on all this. Sort of like the headlines coming out of Europe today about the hottest day ever, and we'll obsess on that for a while, and then we'll move on. It's the Instagram age is what it is. And I think Instagram actually has more of a massive impact on kiddos and the generation that is rising than the COVID years ever will.
Yeah, I worry about that. My boys are young, but people, I used to think, it makes me sound, like kids today, but there's such an obsession with self. I take pictures. I put kids and food and sometimes political campaign coverage on Instagram. I try as hard as I can to never put myself on Instagram. So you wonder where all this is going to lead. I think, Hugh, the difference between our pandemic and the pandemic of 2018 is a different expectation of health. We expect to be healthy. We expect to not be infected. We live in an age of vaccines and treatments. And, at that period in history, as innovative as it was for the time, and there are still, I've read about this because of our pandemic, there are architectural designs of buildings in New York in particular and others that are relate to what people learned or experienced during that pandemic. They didn't expect to live a life free of medical challenges because they didn't have the technology.
You are so on spot here. Expectations drive the significance level because if your expectation of infant mortality is significantly higher in 1918, but it did shock them, but they're coming out of a world war. And our expectation today is the curated life that we see on Instagram, which isn't really life at all, right? You don't really know.
Not at all.
What is that, Joni Mitchell? You really don't know life at all if you know life through Instagram. You don't.
Yeah. And look, we have a 24-hour news cycle that can deem every horrible human tragedy into our house as though it's happening next door. And it just changes the way you look at things. But, in 1918 and in the 20s, they couldn't seal themselves off hermetically in their house and get things delivered in boxes. So you just had to live. But we
even
could.
when the caskets were piling up in Philadelphia, they could not bury the dead in Philadelphia. There were so many people dying in the 1918 influenza that they could not bury the dead, and they stacked them up outside. And that generation did not talk about it the way mine does the Kennedy assassination as being a thing to, and people will be a little bit nostalgic. Watch, this will be long after I'm off the air, right? 20 years from now, they'll be a little bit nostalgic about the COVID years if they got through them unscathed. Do you agree with me, David?
Yeah. Yeah, to some degree. Or maybe, maybe it depends on what age the kids are, and they'll remember how they get to stay home every day. But I think it also depends on, again, my kids had each other. My boys are 3 years apart, and I sometimes think how lucky I am that they had each other to play with and interact with, so they weren't bereft for 2 years of social interaction. The headmaster at our school believed in on-campus education, so they got to go back relatively soon. Didn't have the same challenges that other kids are still having.
Yeah, and they weren't in the Baltimore school system, which I just was reading an article about, has failed so spectacularly that maybe they'll do something about it. Attorney Crump is up there trying to sue them into doing something in Baltimore. David M. Drucker on Twitter. Thank you, David. Go and read if you haven't yet. I'd love to have your essay on the essay because it's a big deal. We'll be right back, Americans. Hugh Hewitt. Hi, Canada. Voting has gotten underway among British Tory members of Parliament for the new Prime Minister round 3. Not yet. I mean, you don't pick the final one until September. But they're down to 4. Rishi Sunak, Penny Mordaunt, Liz Truss, and Kemi Badenoch, and it's begun. They've got 358 members have got to cast their ballot. No one knew in 1975 that when Margaret Thatcher defeated former Prime Minister Heath to run the Conservative Party, that it presaged, it prefigured a revolution. It prefigured Ronald Reagan. It prefigured the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of everything. Nobody knew that in 1975. Today could be that day that people look back in 50 years. I'm joined by Byron York. Good morning, Byron. How are you?
Good morning, Hugh. I'm fine.
Are you following the British parliamentary election closely?
Not as much as the heat wave, as a matter of fact. And I was also listening to you speaking to David Drucker before about the lasting effects of the pandemic, which I thought was a pretty fascinating conversation.
Well, I want to go there with you. I just wanted to update people that the voting has begun. I've rethought how to frame this, Byron. In every life, there is a best year and a worst year. Right? There is a horrible year and a terrible year, and there's a really great year. Will the COVID years be the, quote, worst years for the generation, the way that 1930, 31, 32 were for my parents and maybe 9/11 was for us? Will it be the worst year?
Well, we don't know. We don't know what's coming. Something really, really terrible could be coming. But listen, I think that the COVID years revealed some really troubling things about our society and the way things work. Personally, I'm not going to complain about not being able to take a vacation. I was very lucky to have a job that I could already do at home, and anybody who watches cable TV saw that a lot of people started appearing on television from their homes. So it just wasn't a huge thing. But I think that what was done in the schools and what was done with the economy were really, really troubling. I think that COVID revealed an authoritarian streak in a lot of our political and public health elites. It showed a kind of a dangerous and heavily ideological groupthink in the public health establishment. It showed the politicization of public health issues. I think a lot of these were really, really troubling, and we're going to be looking at those for years and years and years and trying to figure out why people did what they did during the COVID years.
It also stripped bare the public education establishment.
Yeah.
A lot of clarity was arrived at from parents beholding how the teachers union manipulated shutdowns and what was being taught because they were looking over their kids' shoulders. There are certainly enduring effects. I mean, I think President Trump did not win re-election because of COVID. I don't know how you beat an incumbent with 3% unemployment and 3% inflation and the strongest economy maybe of my lifetime, certainly of my lifetime, unless COVID comes along and destroys it all and they choose to shut down the government. And we made every wrong choice possible except Operation Warp Speed and getting the vaccinations done. But Byron, for the kids, those who lost 2 years of bad schools are are maybe not as damaged as those who lost 2 years of good schools who come from bad homes. So you might have a four square box: good home, bad school, good school, and I'll tell you how it plays out. But I don't think it's a 9/11 level set of memories collectively. I don't think it's the worst years.
Well, no, 9/11 was 9/11 set off. It reoriented our role in the world. It set off a war on terror that existed for more than 20 years. It set off a security regime at our airports and other places. It really set off huge changes. On the other hand, the COVID changes were really, really damaging. And what happened in the schools, and you're right, it did expose the teachers' unions, but what happened in the schools, I think, were an example of the sort of failure of public policy in dealing with the COVID threat. The personal tragedies that existed during COVID, people who died alone because the authorities would not allow their relatives to be near them in their final hours. I mean, just crazy things.
Well, Byron, let me broach a very. I want to be very careful how I make this analogy. In Uvalde, we saw paralysis on the part of, I think, 400 law enforcement officers.
Yeah.
And in the COVID years, and that paralysis resulted in massive loss of life and tragedy. And maybe some of it couldn't have been prevented, but certainly the response, the paralyzed inability to act, led to the death of children who died from bleeding out and teachers who died from bleeding out. The paralysis at the public health level and at the public education level led to terrible consequences. And I think that's what you're referring to, is that groupthink will kill things if we're not careful of it. But it saved a lot of lives in getting Operation Warp Speed going. I firmly believe the vaccine is very good for the world, and China is still struggling because it's not vaccinated with effective vaccines, but we aren't. So where do we land on this?
Well, I think Operation Warp Speed struck me as kind of the last gasp of a World War II style operation in the American government, in part because President Trump, just born in 1946, heard heroic tales of World War II. He admired American generals in World War II. He just had this sort of view of what he had thought World War II was. And one of the things that the United States did to win World War II was we had this enormous industrial capacity, which we expanded, and we weren't too careful about efficiency. We just threw money at the problem. And that's what Operation Warp Speed did. They knew a lot of the money would not turn out. They funded multiple research projects at a single time. They cut corners all over the place in terms of bureaucracy, and it worked. And so I almost think of Operation Warp Speed as the last World War II.
Well, that's very insightful. The Arthur Herman's book on what we did to get the arsenal of democracy up and running underscores the truth of what you just said. In terms of children 30 years out, I think it's nostalgia. I think it's hula hoop. They will forget the pain. That's what happened in the 1918 pandemic. They will forget the pain, and they will remember the uniqueness.
Maybe. Yes, they will. They absolutely will. There were kids. Their lives didn't change. They've gone on, and that's fine. But I think we have to look at the way we dealt with a public health threat. Was it as big a threat as we treated it? Should we have looked at it differently? This was a big deal. I heard you discussing the 1918 flu epidemic, where people simply didn't make as big a deal of it, even though it was devastating public health crisis. I think we have to look at the way our government handled this thing, and it was the way the public health establishment, once they had vaccines, really de-emphasized treating sick people. The way some public health authorities advocated sort of penalizing the unvaccinated. I mean, the politicization.
Byron,
we're not going to get.
We're not going to get that assessment because it doesn't fit the narrative of legacy media. I mean, we really need a search. They won't do what you're talking about because it does not fit the legacy that DC knows what it's doing, right?
It'll take years. It will actually take years. But there are voices. I mean, obviously there are voices now. And I'm not talking about anti-vax voices. I'm talking about public health voices who are looking and thinking, what did we do? Was it the right thing? Why did the public health establishment think this and think that? So I think that there will be better assessments of public policy during the COVID years within the next 10 years.
I also think it will lead to net assessment. Like if you can, Brian Westbury says we can never shut down the economy this way again. And net assessment is what you need when you, for example, talk about climate policy. You can't just say stop emissions because that has net disaster for the developing world. It's just net assessment has got to become, what am I not seeing? And Byron, I just don't see that in political figures.
No, and I think that looking at, I mean, COVID remains a problem now. If you look at the number of new cases, if you look at the graph starting back in February of 2020 going all the way to today, it remains a problem now, but the public has decided they're not going to shut down because of it.
Agreed, and I don't think we will ever shut down absent an Ebola-like situation. Byron York on Twitter, on Fox, and in the Washington Examiner. Get his newsletter every day from DCExaminer.com. Thank you. Live from Studio Winterfell in the far north, I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined by Geraghty, the indispensable Jim Geraghty of NationalReview.com. And Jim, I asked you to stay for 2 segments today because we got a list to go through. Let me tell you what we got to cover. Sort of like knowing what's on the president's physical fitness test when you're in 6th grade. We got to figure out how low can Joe Biden go because he's an all-time new low for economic competency at 30%. Will we get another Thatcher out of the British parliamentary change? Are the children of COVID rather like the children of the corn? And then the media numbers in Gallup yesterday have touched all-time lows. So I got 4 things. Let's start with Joe because you wrote about it at length yesterday. It was kind of awful to read. I felt bad for Joe Biden after you were done dismembering him.
I was mostly, using the trip to Saudi Arabia as the jumping off point, and it's interesting to use that term because, look, you and I.
That's terrible.
You and I and lots of listeners to this podcast or this program probably always have this sense of Biden. What's he doing now? But watching him just get absolutely pantsed by the Saudis. Basically get a handful of magic beans and promises in exchange for genuine concessions of the fist bump and the restoration of MBS's, image on the world stage. He really looked like the bully getting the sand kicked in his face.
Yep.
And as an American, I don't like that. I want the American president to be respected on the world stage, and this is one step away from MBS saying, dance, monkey, dance. You're going to dance, and I'm going to give you maybe I'll give you a little bit of oil next month. We'll see how I feel about it. It was really one of the rare moments of watching Biden. No, then of course he says, "Oh, I stood up to him behind closed doors." Now maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I hope he did. I hope this isn't Biden being conciliatory in the actual meeting. And then,
and we should tell people just because the Saudis say that didn't happen doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Correct. It's very much in the Saudis' interest to say, I don't remember him saying anything about that.
Yeah. So again, number one, 30%. Can he go any lower? I mean, there's actually a statistical wall here.
Yeah. No, I'm going to say he can go lower because it's now becoming socially acceptable for Democrats to say, yeah, I don't have faith in this guy anymore.
Good.
This is not what I expected.
Because
I think in a way, like one of the, if you're a Republican hoping for big wins in the midterms, now you have to worry about whether Democrats say, well, it's all Biden's fault. We picked a loser. We got a lemon. He's terrible, but I can still vote for my local Democratic, officials.
Look, I'm already worried about overconfidence. I am. I'm already worried about overconfidence because people think the schools are already fixed, and they're not. Let me go to that. This parental panic that the Wall Street Journal has written about today. You are the parent of youngsters, and I am the grandparent of youngsters, and I'm not worried about what they went through in the last 2 years because they didn't lose a parent. They weren't one of the unlucky ones, one of the tragic ones. But the Wall Street Journal essay is about parents splurging to make up for lost time. I mean, this was not the Great Depression for children generally. It was bad.
Oh, Hugh, I'm going to rare moment of strong disagreement here.
All right, go ahead, go, shoot.
Sure. Yes, it's not the same as losing a parent. I don't want to, downplay the seriousness for those who did lose a parent, either from COVID or anything else. But speaking to a counselor that works with kids and teenagers, and basically said, socially and developmentally, almost everybody's 2 years behind where they otherwise would be.
Well, I can stipulate to that. Oh, I agree. I agree. But let me ask it this way.
Moodiness. I mean, basically just interacting with people, everything that usually happens during those 2 years. We had 1 year in which basically school didn't occur. And then the next year you had, semi-opening, slow opening. Here in Fairfax County, they went back. We had 1 week which they said was a snow closure, but it just happened to align with when Omicron was terrible. It took a long time to get the kids out of masks. People haven't seen facial expressions on each other for a long time. It's been a long, slow process of coming back, and that's not even getting to the learning loss and all that kind of stuff.
The learning loss is significant, and everything you talk about is real. But I want to ask you, when your kids are your age, not my age, your age, when they're your age, will they look back at the COVID years as the 2 worst years of their life, generally speaking, for that generation?
I think probably that first year where you weren't allowed to go out and see your friends, where you couldn't go out to school, you couldn't have anybody over. All the parents around you were freaking out. You had to have food delivered, or you had to wear masks and all that kind of stuff. I mean, the other thing is as you know, my kids are blessed with the best parents in the whole wide world.
Yep.
But there are other parents here in Authenticity Woods who went to DEFCON 1, who were full of very much the wearing two masks, were washing down our groceries and all that kind of stuff. So if you see your parents freaking out, believing they could die at any moment if they don't wipe down something properly, it's going to give you anxiety.
I didn't know you lived in Authenticity. I thought you were over in the Virtue Terraces, and so I didn't know you were in Authenticity Woods in D.C. That's okay. It's a small world. All right, now look, we got to move on because I got to do one other thing with you before we go to the Thatcherite moment or not, and that is that Gallup has a new poll out yesterday that shows trust in media is at an all-time low of 16%. Great trust in media is at an all-time low of 16%. And, of course, the number of Republicans who have confidence, great deal, is at 5%, Democrats at 35%, independents at 12%. It's fallen off the floor, Jim. They've reached statistical lows I did not think was possible. What does that tell you?
I think one thing it tells me is that when you're asked about the media, I suspect a lot of people's first thought is whatever media drives them crazy the most. Maybe it's CNN, maybe it's the New York Times, maybe it's NBC or something like that. If people said, is there media you trust, they'd probably say yes. And if there's, what media do you trust? I'm pretty sure they'd say the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Yeah, of course they would.
I hope they say National Review. I hope they say, certain things that they like, maybe Fox News or something like that. And, so people say, all right, so when people now associate media with the ones they dislike the most. And look, let's face it, CNN, the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, MSNBC, those are all big, NPR, those are all big and powerful and influential institutions. No two ways about that. But I think people are now, and everybody, whatever case is worst in their mind, maybe it's Dan Rather, maybe it's BuzzFeed or something, whatever the worst journalism they've ever, Chris Cuomo, whatever example is worse, that's one that's going to stick in their mind. And they're going to say, oh my goodness, how this place is going down the tubes. I can't trust them. They make stuff up. They exaggerate. They don't cover the stuff that's really important. That's
all those brands that you named, Jim. Yeah. I clump under legacy media, and I suggest to you that the attempt to manipulate and curate our news is now so pervasive and obvious. It's not even subtle anymore. My favorite example of the morning is the New York. I got to find it for you because it's just really quite a remarkable headline about abortion in the black communities. It doesn't really cook in the black community the way it does in progressive land. The traditional African-American church, for example, is not really sold on abortion. And so here it is. Democrats navigate nuanced views on abortion among black voters. This is an article in the New York Times today. Faced with a streak of conservatism about abortion among some black Americans, a vital constituency for President Biden, Democrats are framing the issue as part of a broader civil rights struggle. Now, that is a narrative, Jim.
Yeah.
And it's so obviously a narrative as opposed to saying we have to lie to blacks about our abortion agenda, which is what that really is.
This is what you should think of this, right? This is what, and on the one hand, is it good to know this is what the Democrats are attempting to sell? This is a strategy? Sure. But it's a largely friendly, we're going to carry that message ahead for you.
Yes.
It's different if here's how Republicans are attempting to exploit the, conservative streak in the African-American community.
Well, contrast it with the gun story this morning. We'll come back and do Brits afterward. The gun story this morning about the hero in Indianapolis. 3 people are dead, but for the civilian. And the headline on the New York Times down is police praise him. Then it goes over to what he stopped, and in the Washington Post, it's, oh my gosh, people are running around with guns stopping killers. Rampage in Indiana, a rare instance of armed civilian ending mass shooting. That's curated, Jim.
First of all, Hugh, I hope he doesn't have anything controversial posted on his social media.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
Because then we'll know about it. We will know.
We will know. He won't be a hero for long.
As a teen, anything like that. It's one of those things where, look, if you look, the issue, almost all issues are actually more complicated than they seem. Much more complicated than a party platform would make you think. So in other words, are there people out there who have guns who shouldn't? Sure. Right? We've seen that in Highland Park and places like that. Boy, I would love it if parents would stop signing off on their children getting guns when they know the children have all kinds of emotional and psychological issues. But in this case, there are armed citizen stories. My friend Cam Edwards does usually one a day on his program, at least he used to. And there's this, if you acknowledge it, like, okay, sometimes good people use guns, sometimes bad people use guns.
But if you acknowledge it, you're helping destroy lives and proliferate guns. It's just like the media has lost the confidence of the American people because they've lost their neutrality. I'll be right back to find out whether this is Thatcher 2.0 day in the United Kingdom. Does Kemi come out on top? Jim Geraghty is here to divine what the Brits are doing even as we speak on the Hugh. Welcome back, America. Big Jim Geraghty is with us. Jim Geraghty at Twitter. Geraghty the Indispensable, we call him. Jim, I want to read you Niall Ferguson, historian extraordinaire, Hoover Institution fellow, tweeted just minutes ago, after we went to break, in fact. The rise of the very talented Kemi Badenoch is truly remarkable. She would be a Tory Obama if she won this. The whole leadership contest is a disaster for the bogus narrative that Brexit was motivated by racism and or nostalgia for empire. Because, it's Rishi Sunak and 3 women. One of them is black and was born in London and raised in Nigeria, Kemi Badenoch. In 1975, nobody thought that the Conservatives had changed history when they put Margaret Thatcher in front of their party. But they had. You think that's happening now, or is Rishi good enough?
It's like of the 4 options, they're all going to, quote-unquote, look different than Boris Johnson and David Cameron and most of the folks who've been leading the Conservative Party since Margaret Thatcher.
And Gordon Brown and every British leader since Margaret Thatcher, right?
Yeah.
Theresa May was stiff and white, but she was a woman.
There were reasons for, both British in general and Conservatives to like Boris Johnson. In many ways, I've looked at him. He's basically a Harry Potter character come to life. You could see him as the guest professor at one of those years.
Yeah, the deadly arts professor. Yes.
Yeah. But his entire, background was boarding schools and all the right circles and all. There was no. The weird thing is that he could occasionally strike this populist look by this populist, chord. 1 through Brexit, but 2 just by being this constantly disheveled.
Outlandish. An outlandish character.
It didn't matter what time of day, what situation, whichever world leader he was meeting, he always looked like he just got out of bed.
And of course, he showed up in Kyiv first. God bless him.
No, and then he would do so. Or this video of him, flying the plane yesterday.
Yes.
By the way, there's nothing like saying, "Hey, you know what? They're going to throw me out of office. I might as well do whatever the heck I want."
Let's get behind an F-18 Super Hornet or a Typhoon.
What are they going to do? Throw me out? Churchill got thrown out too. I've finally emulated my hero. Boris Johnson had his strengths. I think it's also very clear that both the party and probably the British public as a whole kind of got tired of his shtick. There's also a sense that, if you were going to take over the reins of a major world power, summer 2019 was a rough. You didn't realize just what a storm you were about to step into.
I got to say, by the way, never Trumpers are going to hate when I say this. When Donald Trump was on this show 6 months ago, he said, Boris has really gone all in on the climate stuff. That's really bad. And you know what? It is really bad. And his tax policy is really bad. It's not Thatcherism at all, Jim Geraghty.
The irony is, obviously the political dynamics have always been a little bit different over there. You saw that in that surprisingly close relationship between George W. Bush and Tony Blair of the Labour Party, at least on international and, more on terror issues. The British Conservative Party, Boris was going to be really tough on Brexit, which I think a lot of conservatives, both here and there, would say was important. But he was going to be something of a new Democrat, Bill Clinton centrist at most on a bunch of these other issues. And the idea is that you'd give Labor, nowhere to run. That there was, he was significantly to the left that he would make them look like a fringe. And it helped it, by the way, that Labor had nominated its own fringe candidates. But in the end, this is if you don't give people a choice, that's when you get these real intense populist undercurrents going, because people argue about, it's like we've got a mono party. There are two.
And by the way, Kemi Badenoch is a huge would-be a Tory Obama, but Rishi Sunak would be the first Indian Brit of Indian descent to do this too. And I mean, that's an enormous thing, right?
Yeah. Every once in a while, you talk to someone who's British, particularly during the Obama years, and they would sense this almost a sense of envy, right? This recognition that, look, America's got a messy, ugly history, particularly in its treatment of African Americans. And yet somehow, obviously we've gone through enormous struggles to become a more perfect union, a more equal country. And a lot of people, I think one of the big reasons Obama got elected was people say, you know what, when we have a black president, that will mean racism is gone. Obviously, it hasn't quite worked out that way. Obviously, was it Iowa Hawk who kept saying my favorite part of the... Was it Iowa Hawk or X-John who kept saying my favorite part of the Obama era is all the racial healing?
Are you going to force me to disclose again that I am Iowa Hawk? I do that annually anyway on Twitter. Jim Geraghty, get his National Review newsletter. Go over to nationalreview.com, sign up for it, subscribe to National Review, and read everything he does. Thank you, Jim.